Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to Earwax. I'm Colin, and today we're going to be doing a review of the brand new Kim Deal album, Nobody Loves You More. Alright, guys, so this is the first full length solo album from legendary indie rocker Kim Deal, famously of Pixies and The Breeders, and a handful of other projects. Now, she has released some solo material previous to this album, but this is her first, full blown, indie label, full length album, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, it's definitely interesting. So I got really excited for this album when I heard the first single that was released, which is Crystal Breath. And based off that single, I definitely expected something a little bit different from this album. But that doesn't mean that it's not good. Before we get into the music itself, though, let's talk about the physical release. And as always, guys, if you could please like and subscribe if you haven't already, I greatly appreciate it. It definitely helps me out. So I pre-ordered this pretty quickly after its announcement, after hearing Crystal Breath on my local indie radio station a couple of times. And I gotta say, I've got mixed feelings about the actual release itself. So first and foremost, I got this in on Monday, which is very impressive because as of recording of this album, this is Thursday, November 21st. The album actually doesn't even release until tomorrow, Friday, November 22nd. So getting this a full 4 or 3 days before the actual release of the album is pretty cool. It definitely makes me feel a lot more important than I actually am, which is not very important. But I will say it definitely leaves something to be desired as far as a physical release goes. It is obviously, again, like an indie label, 4AD, that's been her label for a long time. It's where like the Pixies were originally signed to back in the 80s. Long standing indie label. But that being said, I mean, you could definitely do a little bit more with a physical release, especially for like the first pressing of this album. So I do like the cover artwork a lot. It's really cool. It very much fits with the vibe of the album, which is very like dreamy and a little surrealist and a little, almost like vaudevillian at some points. On the back, it's just Kim holding a flamingo, which again, I do feel like it fits in very well with the themes of the album, especially sonically. But that's it. It's just the external sleeve. There's nothing really on the inside except for the interior sleeve and the record itself. So you've got just the track listing on both sides, as well as some credits. Pretty much what I got from these credits is that Kim composed all the music herself and then had a pretty substantial size of musicians and performers to actually play on the album with her. I will say this though, the actual like color variant of this album I think is gorgeous. It's the limited sparkle universe variant, which you can see it kind of well here. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but it's black with like, there we go, that's a little bit better. It's black with like these kind of blue-ish sparkles kind of thrown throughout it. And honestly, it looks really good. I'm not going to lie. I think it's a really cool aesthetic. It definitely feels like you're staring into space, which I think was the intention behind it. But, outside of that, like, it's a fairly underwhelming release. There's no insert, there's no poster, there's nothing like that. I definitely would have liked to have a little bit more. But overall, it does sound pretty good. I had to turn it up a little bit louder than I normally would like on my record player. There's no skips, there's no pops, there's no crackling, anything like that. So overall, it's a fairly decent release. But I think that the actual packaging and the delivery of it definitely leaves a little bit to be desired. With that out of the way, let's talk about the album itself. So yeah, I think my biggest issue with this album is that based off, again, the lead single that was released in Crystal Breath, I expected more just like straight up rock songs. And really, where this album kind of leans into is a lot more of like a dream pops, indie pop kind of direction, which is not a bad thing. Like it's a good album. It really is. I was just a little bit disappointed on like my first few listens, but you always have to kind of take your expectations and put them to the side when you're listening to an album for the first time, when you're especially if you're like reviewing an album, you have to do your best to just listen to it and kind of experience it for what it is. And by my fourth listen of this front to back, I definitely feel like I got there. So the album opens up with the title track of Nobody Loves You More. And it's an interesting song. I think it's a good way to start the album. It's very orchestral. There's some like really dreamy and sweeping strings. The horns kind of come in and they're very, again, like almost borderline vaudevillian. They're very playful, kind of very theatrical. Kim's voice is just ethereal and beautiful on this. Some beautiful, like, just indie acoustic kind of dream pop scattered throughout. And the drums are a little jazzy as well, which you'll see a few more times on this album. And it's a good song. It really is. The music video that goes along to it is beautiful as well. And I think the first time I heard it, I was a little thrown off because it was again, it's just a very gentle way to open the album. But it's not a bad thing by any means. It was just a little unexpected. But then we get into Coast, and Coast, it sounds like almost every other kind of dreamy indie pop song to come out in the past 20 years. Like, there's nothing super unique or outstanding about this track. It's not bad by any means, but there's nothing like super interesting about it. The guitars do get a little bit surfy at like some points, but it's not enough to really like bring me back into being super interested and invested in the song. It's an experience and a feeling that I definitely had a couple times throughout this album where like it's not a bad song, but it's just nothing about it that's like super, super interesting to me. But then we get into Crystal Breath, which I have made very clear is the reason that I bought this album. I mean, I've always been a Kim Deal fan. I love, early Pixies work. I love The Breeders. I haven't gotten super into some of her later stuff, but it's this song in particular just absolutely hooked me. It's kind of a slight electronic leaning, just like indie rock track, but the guitars are super crunchy and driving. Her vocals are very hypnotic, very catchy. It's a super, super fun song. There's like a short little like kind of psychedelic break in the middle, and it's definitely a song that keeps you on your toes, but one that you'll find yourself like nodding your head along to as you listen to it more and more and more. Definitely a highlight on the album for sure. But then we go into Are You Mine, which I feel like is just right back into like the indie dream pop, the more kind of acoustic laid back stuff that you see on the majority of this album. Again, not a bad song by any means. The guitars have a little bit of almost like a country twang to them. There are some parts that do get a little surfy, but overall it's just not like a super exciting song. But it's good. Like it's you can tell the songwriting and the composition on this album is very well done. And I think my biggest issue with it is that I just wish we had a little bit more like straight up rock, especially coming out of Crystal Breath. It's a little jarring to go straight back into like the laid back kind of like dream pop. But then we get into Disobedience, which is a bit more of just like a straight up indie rock track. The guitar tones that she's using here are very classic, kind of, you get a lot of Pixies vibes from them. The drums are steady, they're good, they're well done. It's still a little bit on the softer side as far as like what I was like looking for in this album, but it's a great written song, and it proves why Kim is one of the best songwriters of like the past 30 years. And then we get into probably my least favorite song on the album, which is Wish I Was. This is just again another like kind of bland laid back indie dream pop track. It's not bad. The guitars are a little linear, the little boring. The drums are like very uninspired. But it's again, it's not like a bad song. Like I didn't have a bad time listening to it. It's just not super exciting. By this point, it's now the third song that's kind of leaning in this direction and has very similar songwriting aesthetics as a few of the other ones. And it's just I'm getting a little tired of it, honestly. Towards the end, though, we do get some kind of interesting, kind of mellow surf guitar licks, but not enough to really, I feel like, save the track. Thankfully, though, we then get into Big Ben Beat, which is one of the harder songs on the album. After like Crystal Breath, it's got some dark driving guitars. The vocals, Kim's vocal delivery on this is very strong. It's very pointed. It's very intentional. The drums come in super hard as well. It's a really, really fun song. And it almost makes me a little sad because I feel like if I had more of this on the album, I would have been way more into it. And like, this is what I was kind of looking for on the album. But there's like, it's just a classic, like kind of edgier experimental indie rock track, and definitely what you want from one of the best like musicians in that genre. And then we get into a little bit of like a kind of a intermission track with Bats in the Afternoon Sky. It's an instrumental track that really isn't much of a song. It's got like some wordless vocal harmonies and the occasional kind of like heavier bass line, some very like subdued and repressed percussion, and then just kind of scattered guitar notes kind of throughout it. And it's pretty short as well. Then it gets into Summerland, which is kind of back into the jangly dream pop again. This one does have some more like kind of lounge jazz vibes, especially with the percussion and with her vocals on this. You definitely can like close your eyes and picture it in more of like a cocktail lounge setting. But I do really like the kind of airy and ethereal strings that she gets on this one. And it does, even though it fits into like a lot of the mold of some of the previous tracks on this album, it is one that I found myself enjoying more than I thought I would. And then after that is Come Running, which is a little bit more rock oriented than a couple other songs. Still very mellow, still very laid back, but it definitely has some classic like indie vibes to it. It's almost a little like shoegazy in some parts as well. And then we end with Good Time Pushed. And this is probably one of my favorite songs on the album. I think this is the best example of kind of like the indie pop that we've heard up to this point. It's super catchy. It's very easy to sing along with. The guitars are driven, but still very like laid back. You've got the drum work here is very straightforward, but it's really good as well. It fits in super well with the song. The guitar does this fun thing where it like kind of takes a back seat to the bass and the vocals and percussion until it needs to be front and center, and then it comes back and swells in a manner that is really uplifting. And the way that it kind of teeters back and forth between that dynamic is really fun. It's just a really well written and performed song. So overall, like I did end up really enjoying this album. It wasn't what I was expecting it to be, and it wasn't necessarily what I wanted it to be, but that's okay. You know, sometimes your favorite albums are ones that kind of surprise you or throw you off a little bit. And I was definitely not expecting the amount of like laid back, mellow, even orchestral compositions that we got on this album. But it doesn't mean they're bad. Like they're very good, they're very well done, and it's an interesting direction for Kim to take her first like official solo project. And I think if you're a fan of her work, if you're a fan of her, career, or even if you're just a fan of laid back, kind of mellow indie music in general, this is something you're really going to enjoy. So I'm feeling a B plus on it. I think it's a solid album. I don't think there's any like bad songs, even if there's a couple that I just wasn't super into. I think it's definitely deserving of a higher grade, even though it wasn't necessarily what I was looking for when I first was teased a couple of the tracks. So that's going to be it for me, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Please, again, like and subscribe if you haven't yet. It definitely helps me out. I also have a Patreon. I'm gearing up to do a lot more exclusives on there, so definitely go check it out. It helps me out a lot. And as always, I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.